Sarah Chen walked through the quiet streets of Millbrook every morning at exactly 7:30. She carried her brown leather bag and kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with the neighbors who waved from their porches. Most people in the small town thought she was simply shy, but Sarah had much bigger reasons for keeping to herself. The 28-year-old librarian lived alone in a tiny apartment above the old bakery on Main Street. Her life was simple and predictable, which was exactly how she needed it to be. Every day she unlocked the library doors, organized books, helped visitors find what they needed, and locked up when evening came. She ate dinner alone, watched old movies, and went to bed early. To everyone around her, Sarah seemed like the most ordinary person in Millbrook. But Sarah carried a secret that would terrify most people and change the world if anyone discovered it. She could heal any living thing with just the touch of her hands. Plants that were dying came back to life when she brushed against them. Sick animals recovered instantly when she petted them. Even tiny cuts on her own skin disappeared within seconds. Sarah had been born with this incredible gift, but she had spent her entire life hiding it from everyone. Her grandmother, Liu Chen, had raised Sarah after her parents died in a car accident when she was only 5 years old. The old woman had the same healing ability, and she knew the dangers that came with such power. Grandmother Liu had lived through terrible times in her home country, where people with special abilities were captured by the government and forced to use their gifts for war. She had seen friends disappear in the middle of the night, never to be seen again. When Sarah was just 6 years old and accidentally healed a bird with a broken wing in front of her grandmother, the old woman sat her down for the most important conversation of her life. Grandmother Liu held Sarah's small hands in her wrinkled ones and spoke in a serious voice that the little girl had never heard before. "Sarah, my dear child, you have been blessed with something very special, but it is also very dangerous. There are people in this world who would hurt you and use you if they knew what you could do. You must promise me that you will never show your gift to anyone, not to friends, not to teachers, not to anyone who is hurt or sick, no matter how much you want to help them." Young Sarah had not understood why helping people could be wrong, but she promised her grandmother anyway. As she grew older and saw more of the world, she began to understand. People feared things they could not explain. They wanted to control things that seemed magical or impossible. Sarah learned to hide her gift so well that sometimes she almost forgot she had it. The hardest part was watching others suffer when she knew she could help them. When her neighbor Mrs. Patterson got cancer, Sarah had to listen to her crying through the thin walls night after night. She wanted so badly to knock on the door and place her hands on the sick woman, but she remembered her grandmother's warnings. Mrs. Patterson died 6 months later, and Sarah cried for days knowing she could have saved her. At the library, Sarah saw children come in with bruises from accidents, adults with obvious pain from old injuries, and elderly people struggling with illnesses that made simple tasks difficult. Every day was a test of her willpower. Her hands would sometimes shake when she gave books to people who were clearly suffering, fighting the urge to heal them. Sarah had tried to use her gift in secret sometimes. She would sneak into the town park at night and heal dying flowers and sick trees. She told herself this was safe because plants could not talk about what she had done. But even this small use of her ability made her nervous. She worried that someone might notice how the park always looked unusually healthy and green. The loneliness was almost unbearable. Sarah had never had a real relationship because she was afraid of getting too close to someone and accidentally revealing her secret. She made polite conversation with library visitors and neighbors, but she never let anyone become a real friend. She spent her evenings reading books about normal people living normal lives, wishing she could be like them. Sometimes Sarah wondered what her life would have been like if she had been born without her gift. She might have become a doctor or nurse, helping people in traditional ways. She might have had a husband and children, a house full of laughter instead of her quiet apartment. She might have traveled the world instead of hiding in a tiny town where nothing ever changed. But Grandmother Liu's voice always echoed in her mind whenever she started to feel sorry for herself. The old woman had died when Sarah was 22, but her final words had been a reminder of the promise Sarah had made as a child. "Keep the secret, dear one. The world is not ready for people like us. Maybe someday it will be different, but not today. Stay hidden and stay safe." So Sarah continued her quiet life, surrounded by people but feeling completely alone with her secret. She had no idea that everything was about to change and that soon she would face the most difficult choice of her life. The gift that had been hidden for so long was about to demand its freedom, whether Sarah was ready or not. Every morning when Sarah woke up and looked at herself in the mirror, she practiced the same routine she had been doing for over 20 years. She reminded herself to be careful, to keep her hands to herself, and to remember that helping others would only lead to danger. But deep inside, a small voice was getting louder each day, asking her how long she could keep living a lie while people around her suffered needlessly. Sarah had no way of knowing that in just a few days, that voice would become impossible to ignore. The rain started falling early on Tuesday morning, turning the quiet streets of Millbrook into slippery ribbons of danger. Sarah Chen pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders as she walked toward the library, watching her feet carefully to avoid puddles. The weather forecast had warned everyone about the storm, but Sarah needed to open the library on time like she did every day. She was only 3 blocks away from work when she heard the sound that would haunt her dreams for weeks to come. First came the screech of brakes fighting against wet pavement, then the horrible crash of metal hitting wood, followed by the most terrifying sound of all: complete silence. Sarah looked up from watching her feet and saw the yellow school bus tilted at a strange angle against the large oak tree on Maple Street. The front of the bus was crumpled like paper, and steam rose from the damaged engine. For a moment, everything seemed frozen in time. Then the screaming started. Children's voices filled the air, calling for help, crying for their parents, and making sounds of pain that cut through Sarah's heart like knives. She dropped her bag and ran toward the bus, her grandmother's warnings completely forgotten in the face of such tragedy. The bus driver, Mr. Jenkins, was slumped over the steering wheel with blood running down his face. Sarah could see through the cracked windshield that he was breathing, but barely. Behind him, 23 children, between the ages of 6 and 12, were trapped in a maze of twisted metal and broken glass. Other people began arriving at the scene. Mrs. Rodriguez from the corner store called the emergency services while Mr. Thompson, the retired firefighter, tried to force open the bus door. Sarah stood frozen on the sidewalk, her hands shaking as she watched the chaos unfold around her. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, followed closely by the fire department and police. Sarah watched as the emergency workers carefully removed child after child from the wreckage. Most of the children had cuts and bruises, broken arms, and concussions, but they would recover with proper medical care. Then they brought out Emma Martinez. The 7-year-old girl was unconscious and barely breathing. Her small body was so still that Sarah thought she might already be gone. The paramedics worked frantically, checking her pulse and trying to stabilize her condition before loading her into the ambulance. Sarah heard one of them whisper to his partner that it did not look good. Next came David Park, a 10-year-old boy who had been sitting near the point of impact. His leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and there was a deep cut on his head that would not stop bleeding despite the pressure bandage the paramedics applied. His eyes were open, but he seemed confused and kept asking for his mother in a weak voice. The third child was the one who broke Sarah's heart completely. Little Sophia Williams, only 6 years old, had long brown hair just like Sarah's younger sister had before she died in the same car accident that killed their parents. Sophia was awake but struggling to breathe, and Sarah could see something was seriously wrong with her chest. The paramedics were very worried about internal injuries. Sarah followed the ambulances to Millbrook General Hospital, telling herself she just wanted to make sure the children were okay. She sat in the waiting room with dozens of worried parents, listening to hushed conversations about the accident and watching doctors deliver updates with serious expressions on their faces. The news got worse as the day went on. Emma Martinez had serious brain injuries and had fallen into a coma. The doctor said there was swelling in her brain that they could not control, and her chances of survival were very small. David Park had multiple internal injuries along with his broken bones, and he needed surgery that might not save his life. Sophia Williams had punctured lungs and internal bleeding that the medical team was struggling to stop. Sarah listened to the devastating updates while sitting next to the children's families. Emma's mother held her husband's hand and cried silently, whispering prayers in Spanish. David's father paced back and forth in the hallway, making phone calls to relatives and trying to stay strong for his wife. Sophia's grandmother sat alone in a chair, too shocked to speak or cry. As the hours passed, Sarah felt something changing inside her. The voice that had been whispering in her head for years was getting louder and more demanding. Every time she looked at the grieving families, every time she heard a doctor deliver more bad news, Every time she thought about those three innocent children fighting for their lives, her grandmother's warnings seemed less important. By evening, the situation had become critical. The doctors told Emma's parents to prepare for the worst. David was in surgery, but the medical team was not optimistic about his chances. Sophia was stable for the moment, but her condition could change quickly, and there was nothing more the hospital could do for her. Sarah sat in her car in the hospital parking lot as darkness fell over Millbrook. She had not eaten all day and had never even made it to work at the library. Her hands were still shaking, but now it was not from shock or fear. It was from the enormous effort it took to keep herself from walking back into that hospital and healing those three dying children. For the first time in her life, Sarah questioned everything her grandmother had taught her. What was the point of having the power to save lives if she never used it? What kind of person could watch innocent children die when she had the ability to heal them with just a touch? Her grandmother had been afraid of what people would do to Sarah if they discovered her gift. But what about what Sarah was doing to herself by hiding it? The rain continued to fall as Sarah sat alone in the darkness, facing the most important decision of her life. 3 children were dying just a few hundred feet away from her, and she was the only person in the world who could save them. The question was no longer whether she could help them. The question was whether she was brave enough to try. Sarah looked up at the hospital windows glowing in the night and made a choice that would change everything forever. She was going to save those children no matter what happened to her afterward. Sarah sat in her car until midnight, watching the hospital lights dim as visiting hours ended. She had made her decision, but she needed to be smart about it. If she was going to risk everything to save these children, she had to do it without being caught. She remembered the layout of Millbrook General Hospital from all the times she had visited her grandmother during her final illness. The children's ward was on the 3rd floor, and there was a back staircase that the cleaning staff used late at night. Sarah had noticed during her earlier visits that security was lighter after midnight, with only one guard at the main entrance and cameras in the hallways. At 12:30 in the morning, Sarah parked her car 3 blocks away from the hospital and walked through the quiet streets. The rain had stopped, but the air was still cold and damp. She wore dark clothes and kept her hood up, trying to look like just another person walking home late from work. The back entrance to the hospital was locked, but Sarah had expected this. During her grandmother's long illness, she had learned that the lock on this door was old and could be opened with a library card if you knew the right technique. It took her 5 minutes of careful work, but finally the door clicked open. Sarah slipped inside and climbed the back staircase to the 3rd floor. Her heart was pounding so loud she was sure someone would hear it, but the hospital was quiet except for the distant sounds of machines beeping and nurses talking in low voices at the main desk. She found the children's ward and carefully checked the room numbers until she located Emma Martinez in room 314. Sarah pressed her ear to the door and listened. She could hear the steady beeping of life support machines and the quiet breathing of someone sleeping in a chair beside the bed. Sarah waited for 20 minutes until she heard footsteps in the hallway. Emma's mother was walking toward the elevator, probably going to get coffee or use the restroom. This was Sarah's chance. She slipped into room 314 and saw little Emma lying very still in the hospital bed. The 7-year-old girl looked so small, surrounded by all the medical equipment. Tubes and wires connected her to machines that were keeping her alive, and her face was pale and peaceful, like she was having a pleasant dream. Sarah approached the bed slowly, her hands trembling with nervousness and anticipation. She had never tried to heal injuries this serious before. She had only healed small cuts on herself and dying plants in her apartment. But she had to try. She placed her hands gently on Emma's forehead, careful not to disturb any of the medical equipment. Immediately, Sarah felt the familiar warm sensation that always came when her healing power activated, but this time it was stronger than she had ever experienced before. Golden light seemed to flow from her hands into Emma's small body. Sarah could sense the damage inside the child's brain, the dangerous swelling that was threatening her life. She focused all her energy on healing the injured tissue, reducing the swelling and restoring the normal flow of blood and oxygen. It took nearly 10 minutes, and by the end, Sarah was exhausted and sweating, but it worked. Emma's breathing became stronger and more regular. Her face gained color, and Sarah could feel that the dangerous pressure in her brain was completely gone. The little girl was going to wake up healthy and whole. Sarah heard footsteps approaching in the hallway and quickly moved to the door. Emma's mother was returning with a cup of coffee. Sarah waited until the woman entered the room, then snuck out and hurried to room 318 where David Park was recovering from surgery. David's room was empty, except for the sleeping boy. His surgery had lasted 6 hours, and the doctors had told his parents that he might not survive the night even if the operation was successful. Sarah could see that he was in pain even while unconscious, and his breathing was shallow and difficult. She placed her hands on David's chest and felt the warm, healing energy flow into his damaged body. His broken ribs mended themselves, his punctured lungs sealed closed, and the dangerous internal bleeding stopped completely. Sarah worked for 15 minutes, healing every injury from the bus accident and reversing all the damage from his difficult surgery. When she finished, David looked like he was sleeping peacefully instead of fighting for his life. His vital signs on the monitor showed that everything was returning to normal. The hardest part was yet to come. Sophia Williams was in room 322, and Sarah knew her injuries were the most severe of all 3 children. She had massive internal damage that would require multiple surgeries and months of recovery, if she survived at all. Sarah found Sophia alone in her room, connected to even more machines than Emma had been. The 6-year-old girl's breathing was labored, and Sarah could hear fluid in her damaged lungs with each breath she took. This healing took the longest of all. Sarah placed her hands on Sophia's chest and abdomen, feeling the extensive damage throughout her small body. Torn organs, internal bleeding, collapsed lung, and damaged ribs all needed to be repaired. Sarah poured every bit of her energy into healing the child, working for nearly 30 minutes until she was so drained she could barely stand. But when she finished, Sophia was breathing easily and naturally. Her color had returned and all her internal injuries were completely healed. She looked like she was having a good dream instead of fighting for her life. Sarah was exhausted and knew she needed to leave immediately, but she made one crucial mistake. As she walked toward the door, she stumbled slightly from tiredness and accidentally brushed against the wall near the security camera. For just a moment, the same golden glow that had healed the children flickered around her hands. She made it out of the hospital without being seen by any people, but she had no idea that her healing power had been recorded on the security system. Sarah drove home and collapsed into bed, feeling more tired than she had ever been in her life, but also strangely peaceful. For the first time in 28 years, she had used her gift to help someone who needed it. 3 children who should have died were now going to live completely normal, healthy lives. Sarah fell asleep, believing that her secret was still safe, and that she had successfully saved 3 lives without anyone discovering what she had done. She had no way of knowing that by morning, everything would be different forever. Sarah woke up at noon the next day, which was unusual for someone who always started work at 8 in the morning. Her body felt like she had run a marathon, and her hands were still tingling from the healing energy she had used the night before. She made coffee and turned on the local news, expecting to hear updates about the 3 children from the bus accident. What she saw on her television screen made her drop her coffee mug on the kitchen floor. The news reporter was standing outside Millbrook General Hospital with a crowd of excited people behind her. The headline at the bottom of the screen read, "Miracle. Recovery baffles doctors," and Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized what had happened. All 3 children, who were critically injured in yesterday's bus accident, have made complete recoveries overnight, the reporter said into her microphone. Doctors are calling it impossible. Emma Martinez, who was in a coma with severe brain injuries, woke up this morning asking for breakfast. David Park, who underwent 6 hours of emergency surgery, is now sitting up in bed and playing video games. And Sophia Williams, whose injuries were described as life-threatening, is laughing and talking with her family as if nothing ever happened. Sarah sank into her chair and watched in horror as the news continued. The reporter interviewed Dr. Stevens, the chief physician at the hospital, who looked confused and frightened. "In my 30 years of medicine, I have never seen anything like this," Dr. Stevens said. "These children should have required months of recovery time if they survived at all. Instead, they show no signs of ever being injured. Their test results are completely normal. It defies every law of medical science. The worst part came next." The reporter announced that the hospital security team was reviewing camera footage from the night before to see if anyone had entered the children's ward without permission. Sarah felt panic rising in her chest as she realized her mistake with the security camera. She grabbed her grandmother's old journal from her bedroom and quickly packed a bag with clothes, money, and important documents. Sarah had always kept an emergency bag ready, just in case something like this happened. Her grandmother had taught her to always be prepared to disappear quickly. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Sarah was driving out of Millbrook in her old Honda, watching her hometown fade away in the rearview mirror. She had lived there for 6 years, but she knew she could never go back. She stopped at a gas station 50 miles away and saw her face on the television inside the convenience store. The security camera footage was blurry and dark, but it clearly showed a woman in a hooded jacket moving through the hospital hallways. The timestamp showed exactly when Sarah had been there. "Police are asking for help identifying this person of interest," the news anchor said. "Anyone with information should contact authorities immediately." Sarah pulled her hood up and quickly paid for gas, keeping her head down and avoiding eye contact with the store clerk. But as she walked back to her car, she heard someone behind her say, "Hey, isn't that the woman from the news?" Sarah did not look back. She got in her car and drove away as fast as she could without attracting attention from police. Her hands were shaking as she realized that people were already starting to recognize her. Over the next few days, Sarah learned just how big the story had become. She stayed in cheap motels and watched the news coverage grow larger and more intense. Medical experts from around the world were flying to Millbrook to examine the 3 children. Religious leaders were calling it a miracle from God. Scientists were demanding investigations into what they called an impossible medical phenomenon. But the worst part was what happened to the children's families. Reporters camped outside their homes asking endless questions about what they had seen or experienced. The families were overwhelmed and frightened by all the attention. Emma's mother broke down crying during a television interview, saying she just wanted her daughter to have a normal life again. Sarah felt terrible guilt as she watched the chaos she had created. She had wanted to save the children quietly, but instead she had turned their families into the center of a media circus. She began to understand why her grandmother had warned her about using her gift. After a week of running, Sarah was staying in a motel in Colorado when she saw the news that changed everything. The FBI had identified her from the security footage. Her name and photo were now on every news channel in the country. Sarah Chen, a 28-year-old librarian from Millbrook, is wanted for questioning in connection with the mysterious healing incident at Millbrook General Hospital, the news anchor announced. Authorities stress that she is not accused of any crime, but they believe she may have information about what happened to the 3 children. Sarah stared at her own face on the television screen and knew that her old life was completely over. There was no going back to her quiet apartment, her job at the library, or her peaceful routine. She was now one of the most famous people in America, and she had never felt more alone. The story got worse over the following days. Sarah learned that government agencies were now involved in the search for her. Scientists wanted to study her. Military officials wanted to understand her abilities, and researchers from around the world were offering money for information about her location. But the most heartbreaking part was the desperate families who began searching for her. Parents with dying children held up signs with her photo, begging her to help their loved ones. Sarah saw them on the news every night, camping outside places where she had been spotted, hoping she would appear and heal their family members. Sarah realized that she had not just exposed herself by saving those 3 children. She had exposed the existence of people like her to the entire world. Now everyone knew that someone with impossible healing powers existed, and they would never stop looking until they found her. As Sarah sat alone in another cheap motel room, dyeing her hair black and planning her next move, she understood that the hunt had only just begun. She was no longer just running from police or government agents. She was running from a world that desperately wanted to find her, use her, control her, or study her. The girl who had spent her whole life hiding was now the most wanted person in America. Sarah had been running for 3 weeks when she finally made a mistake that changed everything. She was tired, hungry, and desperate for a safe place to rest when she decided to stop in the small mountain town of Cedar Falls, Montana. The town was so remote that she hoped nobody would recognize her there. She rented a cabin at the edge of town using fake identification she had purchased from a man in Denver. The cabin was old and simple, but it had everything Sarah needed: privacy, warmth, and no neighbors close enough to see her coming and going. On her second night in Cedar Falls, Sarah was sitting by the fireplace reading her grandmother's journal When she heard a soft knock on her door, her heart immediately started racing. Nobody knew she was there, and she had been very careful not to be seen. Sarah grabbed a kitchen knife and approached the door slowly. "Who is it?" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "Someone who knew your grandmother," came the reply from an old man's voice. "My name is Marcus Webb. I was part of Liu Chen's group many years ago." Sarah's hand froze on the door handle. Her grandmother had never told her about any group or anyone named Marcus, but something in the man's voice made her believe he was telling the truth. She opened the door carefully and saw a tall, thin man in his 70s with white hair and kind eyes. He was alone and looked more tired than threatening. Most importantly, he was not wearing the black suits that government agents always wore on television. "How did you find me?" Sarah asked, still holding the knife but no longer pointing it at him. Marcus smiled sadly. "People like us can sense each other when we get close enough. I felt your presence when you arrived in town. I have been waiting here for someone like you for over 20 years. Sarah led him into the cabin and made coffee while Marcus explained his story. He had met her grandmother in 1962, when they were both young people trying to hide their abilities from the world. Marcus could control electricity with his mind, making lights flicker and machines stop working when he was emotional. "There were 12 of us back then," Marcus said, warming his hands around his coffee cup. "We found each other and formed a group for protection and support. We called ourselves the Hidden Ones. Your grandmother was our healer, just like you are now." Marcus told Sarah about the terrible things that had happened to their group. In 1968, the government discovered their existence and began hunting them down one by one. Some were captured and taken to secret facilities where they were forced to use their abilities for military purposes. Others disappeared completely and were never seen again. "Your grandmother was one of the lucky ones," Marcus explained. "She managed to escape to China and hide there for 10 years before coming back to America with a new identity. But she never forgot what happened to our friends." Sarah felt sick as she listened to Marcus describe the government facilities where people like them were imprisoned. He showed her photographs that he had managed to take secretly over the years. The pictures showed prison-like buildings surrounded by high fences and guard towers. "They call it the Clearwater Institute," Marcus said. "It looks like a research facility from the outside, but it is really a prison for people with abilities like ours. Right now, there are 43 people locked up there, including children as young as 8 years old." Marcus spread out blueprints and satellite photos on Sarah's kitchen table. He had been studying the facility for decades, waiting for the right moment to try to rescue the prisoners inside. "Most of them were captured when they were children," he continued. "They have spent their whole lives in that place, being forced to use their gifts to help the government create new weapons and surveillance systems. They have never known freedom." Sarah stared at the photos of the children imprisoned at Clearwater and felt anger building inside her chest. These kids looked like the students she had seen at the library in Millbrook, but instead of playing and learning, they were trapped in a place that used them like tools. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked. Marcus looked directly into her eyes. "Because you are the first healer we have had since your grandmother died. With your abilities, we could actually succeed in rescuing those people. But I will not lie to you about the dangers. If we try this and fail, we will end up in Clearwater ourselves. Or worse." Over the next several hours, Marcus showed Sarah everything he knew about the government's program to capture and use people with special abilities. The program had been running secretly for over 50 years, and it was getting bigger every year. "They know about you now because of what you did at the hospital," Marcus said. "They are not just trying to arrest you for questioning. They want to add you to their collection. Once they have you, you will never be free again." Sarah thought about her 3 choices. She could keep running forever, always looking over her shoulder and never using her gift to help anyone. She could let herself be captured and spend the rest of her life as a prisoner being forced to heal soldiers and government agents. Or she could fight back and try to free the people who were already trapped. "If we do this," Sarah said slowly, "how many people can we really save?" Marcus smiled for the first time since he had arrived. "All of them. But it will not be easy. And once we start, there will be no going back to hiding. The government will hunt us until the day we die." Sarah looked at the photos of the children imprisoned at Clearwater and thought about her grandmother's warnings about staying hidden. But she also thought about the 3 children she had saved at the hospital and how good it had felt to use her gift for something important. "When do we start?" she asked. Marcus stood up and shook her hand. Tomorrow we begin planning the most important rescue mission in history. For the first time since leaving Millbrook, Sarah felt like she had a real purpose. She was no longer just running away from her problems. She was going to fight back and save people who desperately needed her help. Sarah spent 2 months training with Marcus in the mountains of Montana, learning skills she never thought she would need. Marcus taught her how to move quietly through buildings without being detected, how to disable security cameras, and how to defend herself if guards tried to stop her. But the most important thing Marcus taught her was how to use her healing abilities in new ways. Sarah discovered that she could not only heal injuries, but also make people fall asleep by touching certain pressure points on their bodies. She could also sense other people with abilities from much farther away than she had ever realized. Your grandmother never learned to do these things because she was always too afraid to experiment, Marcus explained during one of their training sessions. But you are going to need every possible advantage for what we are about to do. During their weeks together, 3 other people found them in the mountains. First came Elena Rodriguez, a young woman who could become invisible for short periods of time. She had escaped from a government facility in Texas 5 years earlier and had been hiding ever since. Next was Thomas Kim, a man in his 40s who could read people's thoughts when he touched them. He had been living alone in the woods for 15 years after his family was killed trying to protect him from government agents. Finally, Anna Brooks arrived at their mountain hideout. She was only 19 years old, but she could control metal objects with her mind. Her parents had hidden her ability until she was 17, when she accidentally lifted a car to save her younger brother from being crushed. The government had been hunting her ever since. Together, the 5 of them spent weeks studying the layout of the Clearwater Institute and planning their rescue mission. Marcus had detailed maps of the facility, guard schedules, and information about the security systems that protected the prison. There are 43 people imprisoned inside, Marcus explained during one of their planning meetings. 18 adults and 25 children. They are kept in different sections of the building, and we will need to reach all of them if we want to succeed. The plan was complicated but simple in concept. Elena would use her invisibility to enter the facility first and disable the main security system. Thomas would read the minds of the guards to learn their patrol patterns and find out if there were any changes to the facility layout. Anna would use her metal control abilities to open locked doors and disable weapons if any guards tried to stop them. Sarah would heal anyone who got injured during the rescue, and Marcus would coordinate everything while using his electrical powers to create distractions. They chose a night in late October when the weather forecast predicted heavy rain and thick clouds. The storm would help hide their approach to the facility and make it harder for the security cameras to see them clearly. On the night of the rescue, Sarah felt more nervous than she had ever been in her life. As they drove toward the Clearwater Institute in a stolen van, she kept thinking about all the things that could go wrong. If they failed, not only would they end up as prisoners themselves, but the 43 people inside would never get another chance at freedom. The Clearwater Institute looked exactly like Marcus had described it. From the outside, it appeared to be a normal research building with a few security guards and basic fencing, but Sarah could sense the presence of many people with abilities inside, and she felt sick knowing that some of them had been prisoners for their entire lives. Elena disappeared from sight and slipped through the fence while the rest of the team waited in the woods nearby. 20 minutes later, Marcus received a signal through his radio headset that the main security system was down. Sarah, Marcus, Thomas, and Anna approached the building from different directions, just as they had practiced. Thomas touched one of the guards at the back entrance and immediately learned that there were 12 guards total inside the building, most of them on the upper floors where the adult prisoners were kept. Anna used her abilities to bend the metal locks on the back door, and the team entered the facility quietly. The inside of the building was much worse than Sarah had expected. It looked like a combination of a hospital and a prison, with long hallways lined with heavy metal doors. They found the children first, on the second floor of the building. Sarah's heart broke when she saw them. Some were as young as 6 years old, and all of them looked scared and confused when strangers appeared in their cells. Many of the children had been prisoners for so long that they did not remember life outside the facility. "We are here to help you," Sarah whispered to a little boy who could make fire appear in his hands. "We are going to take you somewhere safe." The children were weak and frightened, but they followed Sarah and the others without question. Some of them had been hurt by the experiments the government scientists performed on them, and Sarah used her healing abilities to fix their injuries as they moved through the building. Finding the adult prisoners was more difficult because they were kept on the third floor with heavier security. Thomas had to touch 3 more guards to learn the locations of all the cells, while Anna twisted the metal locks on 18 different doors. The adults were in much worse condition than the children. Some had been prisoners for over 20 years and had almost given up hope of ever being free. A few of them could barely walk because they had been kept in small cells for so long. But the worst part was learning what the government had been forcing them to do. Sarah met a woman who could see the future and had been forced to predict military attacks. She met a man who could control the weather and had been used to create storms during wars. All of them had been turned into weapons against their will. As they helped the last group of prisoners escape from their cells, alarms began blaring throughout the facility. Marcus had known this would happen eventually, but they had hoped to get everyone out before being discovered. "The guards know we are here," Marcus said into his radio. "Everyone move to the exit points now." Sarah found herself helping an elderly man who had been a prisoner for 30 years when she heard gunshots echoing through the building. The rescue mission had become a battle, and not everyone was going to make it out alive. The gunshots echoed through the Clearwater Institute as Sarah helped the elderly prisoner toward the emergency exit. Behind them, she could hear guards shouting orders and boots running on metal floors. The rescue mission had turned into a desperate fight for survival. Marcus appeared around the corner, supporting a young woman who had been shot in the shoulder. Blood was spreading across her shirt and she was struggling to stay conscious. Sarah immediately placed her hands on the woman's wound and felt the familiar warm energy flow from her fingers. The bullet wound healed completely in seconds, but Sarah could feel her own strength draining away. "There are too many guards," Marcus shouted over the noise of alarms. They called for backup from the main military base 20 miles away. "We have maybe 10 minutes before this place is surrounded by soldiers." Elena materialized next to them, her invisibility power flickering on and off from exhaustion. "I counted at least 30 guards between us and the exit," she said, breathing heavily. "And they have automatic weapons." Thomas was helping a group of children move down the hallway when 3 guards appeared at the far end. Sarah watched in horror as the guards raised their rifles, but Anna stepped forward and used her metal control abilities to twist their weapons into useless shapes. The guards looked shocked as their guns bent like soft clay in their hands. "Everyone stay together," Sarah called out to the 43 rescued prisoners who were crowded in the narrow hallway. "We are going to get out of here, but I need you to trust us and do exactly what we say." The group began moving toward the main exit, but more guards appeared from every direction. Sarah realized that they were trapped in the middle of the building with enemies closing in from all sides. Some of the rescued prisoners were starting to panic, and the children were crying from fear and confusion. That was when Marcus made a decision that changed everything. The old man stepped into the center of the hallway and closed his eyes, concentrating all his electrical powers into one massive surge. Every light in the building went out at the same time. Emergency systems shut down, and electronic locks throughout the facility clicked open, but using so much power at once was too much for Marcus's 70-year-old body. He collapsed to the floor, clutching his chest and struggling to breathe. Sarah knelt beside him and placed her hands over his heart, pouring healing energy into his body. She could feel that his heart was failing from the strain of using his abilities so intensively. "Save your strength for the others," Marcus whispered to Sarah as she tried to heal him. "Get these people out of here and show the world what the government has been doing to us." Sarah refused to give up on him. She used more of her healing power than she had ever used before, feeling her own energy drain away as she fought to save Marcus's life. Around them, the battle continued in darkness as the other team members led the rescued prisoners toward the exits. Finally, Marcus's breathing became steady again, and his heartbeat returned to normal. Sarah had managed to heal the damage to his heart, but she was now so exhausted she could barely stand. Marcus helped her to her feet, and together they followed the group toward freedom. As they reached the main exit, Sarah heard helicopters approaching in the distance. The military backup that Marcus had warned about was arriving, and they had only moments before the building would be completely surrounded. Thomas was using his mind-reading ability to stay ahead of the remaining guards while Anna cleared obstacles from their path with her metal powers. Elena had become visible again to help guide the children through the darkness. All 43 rescued prisoners were finally outside the building and heading toward the woods where they had hidden their vehicles. But as they ran across the open ground between the facility and the forest, spotlights from the approaching helicopters illuminated the entire area. Sarah could see military vehicles racing up the access road, and she knew they would never make it to safety in time. That was when something unexpected happened. One of the rescued prisoners, a teenage boy who had been silent throughout the entire escape, suddenly stopped running and turned to face the approaching soldiers. Sarah watched in amazement as he raised his hands and created a wall of solid ice that stretched across the entire width of the field, blocking the military vehicles from reaching them. Other rescued prisoners began using their own abilities to help with the escape. A woman who could control the wind created a thick fog that hid them from the helicopter spotlights. A man who could manipulate the earth opened up holes in the ground that the pursuing soldiers fell into. Children who had been prisoners their entire lives were finally using their gifts for their own protection instead of for the government's purposes. The group reached the forest safely and split up into smaller teams just as they had planned. Sarah, Marcus, and 8 of the rescued prisoners made it to their vehicle and began driving toward the safe house they had prepared in the mountains, but their victory was bigger than just rescuing 43 people from prison. One of the rescued prisoners had secretly recorded everything inside the Clearwater Institute using a small camera that Elena had given him. The videos showed the terrible conditions in the facility, the experiments that had been performed on prisoners, and the children who had spent their entire lives locked away from their families. Within hours of the rescue, the videos were uploaded to the internet and spread around the world faster than the government could stop them. People everywhere saw the truth about what had been happening to individuals with special abilities. The secret program that had operated for over 50 years was finally exposed to the public. The reaction was immediate and powerful. Protests began in major cities around the world as people demanded answers from their governments. Other individuals with abilities started coming out of hiding, no longer afraid to show what made them different. Support groups formed to help people like Sarah connect with each other safely. Sarah found herself at the center of a global movement that she had never intended to start. The woman who had spent her entire life hiding her gift was now the leader of thousands of people who were fighting for the right to live freely without fear of persecution. 6 months after the rescue at Clearwater, Sarah established the first official safe house for people with abilities in the mountains of Colorado. The facility provided protection, training, and support for individuals who needed help controlling or understanding their gifts. It was everything the Clearwater Institute should have been, but built with freedom and choice instead of fear and control. Sarah often thought about her grandmother's warnings about keeping her gift hidden. She understood now that Liu Chen had been right to be afraid, but she had been afraid of the wrong things. The real danger was not in using her abilities to help others, but in allowing fear to prevent her from living up to her full potential. As Sarah looked out over the mountains surrounding her new home, watching dozens of people with extraordinary abilities working together to build a better world, she finally understood what her grandmother had really meant. Her gift had indeed been too dangerous for the old world to know about, but it was exactly what the new world needed to become possible.